Hey everybody, Grant here again, Mega City Performance. So, go to CV Carb here out of a KLR650. This is the one I did the mixture screw removal, cover removal yesterday. I haven't had this one apart. You can see there's all kinds of crud in this car, but we're not going to go through that just yet. You can actually see on the slide a little bit of dust running through that guy. You can also see your pilot air circuit and your main air jet. Pilot air jet, main air jet. On this side of the carb, you got your trailing throttle enricher. So what that means, when you close your throttle at high RPM, that shuts the air off to the slow speed circuit, the pilot circuit, which helps eliminate backfiring. Got your front of your throttle body, and I'm going to see if we can get a good enough picture here. Man, this carb is dirty. So, I don't know if you're going to be able to see that. My pointing device. So down in here, there are 4 holes a little further back, then 1 hole further up front. These 5 holes are fed by the pilot jet. This is your low speed circuit outlet right here. Air fuel mixture comes out of there. One of the 5 holes is controlled by the mixture screw. If you look further down inside the carb, you can see the fuel nozzle and the needle on the slide. You got your butterfly up front. This side of the carb obviously is just linkages and whatnot. So I'm going to disassemble this, explain a few things as I go, and get everybody familiar with the different circuits in the carburetor. I have not had this carburetor apart yet. Only thing I've done is remove that cover. So this is the first shot at this. No idea how tight those screws are going to be. You can see they're pristine, so probably never been touched. This is really important. I guess I wore the snap-on off. Really good screwdriver. You gotta have a good one. Sometimes I even use an impact driver to start them off. Obviously, if you're going to be smacking an impact driver, you want to lift the carb up a little bit, because if you have that down on a hard surface and smack the impact driver with the hammer, you could break the ear off where the screws go. So that one's loose, that one's loose. Oh, that one was the one I did. That one's loose, that one's loose. Flipping it over, we'll get these ones cracked so I can switch to my other screwdriver, much smaller, easier to work with. So the cap on the slide, the cap on the top of the carb, has little bosses on it that fit in the groove around the hole where the screws go in. So when you're putting that sucker on, you got to watch that. And getting the diaphragm in right is kind of tricky at times. I better get some power to my camera here so it doesn't die. 1 second. And I gotta change that a little bit so my power cord will fit. There we go. Bend that down a little more. Okay, ready to rock and roll. This blue thing I'm using is a little silicone baker's mat. I really like it because it's anti-skid. You can really see anything that's coming out of this carburetor, and it's actually really good for the video as well. So I got my thumb on this cap. I'm holding it down because the slide spring's in there, obviously. Now, take the cap off. You can see, maybe, there you go, a little boss around the 2 corners of the cap. Those fit, and all four corners have the guide holes for those bosses, so the cap can go on anyway. Slide spring, you want to really look at this spring on a high miler carb and just check that there's no flat spots on it, because that'll weaken it. Make sure there's no flat spots. Make sure the coils are pretty evenly spaced. Some guys clip one of the ends off the spring, which helps a little bit in some ways, hurts in other ways. It actually halfway compensates for what the MCP carb kit fixes, but we'll go into that later. Next, you got your slide in here. You can see the retainer, the needle retainer down there, and you can see the diaphragm fits in a groove around the carburetor. Little bit of corrosion in there, so you want to take a little screwdriver or something, scrape all that corrosion out of there to get so that the slide seals good. I'll fix that up later when I'm not doing a video. This video is more to explain the workings of the carburetor. In here, you can see maybe there's a little hole down there. That hole has to line up between the retainer ears. Now I'll push up on the needle, and if you look down in this hole, there's the stock needle, the needle retainer. A lot of guys get this part backwards. They'll put this, I've done it once. They'll put it in like that, and in some cases, maybe on newer carbs, I don't know, this needle actually, on some of these retainers, you can actually push it down inside there. That's wrong. You can see the spring sits on here, and this piece, in conjunction with the spring, holds the needle down. Stock needle, you can see, and it's numbered. It's a standard stock needle. I forget what the number is. It doesn't matter. So we'll get those put aside. One last thing. These pieces, if you look inside the slide, the piece down at the bottom is actually hexagonal shaped like a nut. This sits down in there, and if it's not seated properly, the needle can actually float about, wow, over a quarter inch for sure. So you want to make sure that it's seated properly down in there when you reassemble it. This here is your vacuum hole, raises the slide. This is the one that guys drill out the 7/64. Works pretty good with the MCP carb kit. If you go bigger than 7/64, you may have to put a bigger pilot jet in, because that actually bleeds air into the system, and if it gets too big, you're gonna have to put in a bigger pilot jet. I don't drill them on my bike. Now that I have two carbs, I may drill one and go back and forth. Again, drilling that hole compensates a little bit for the things that the MCP carb kit fixes. There's lots of tricks out there that sort of compensate for the issues with the stock carb. So that's the top. Let's look at the side. I'll grab my good screwdriver again. And there's a heavy spring under here. Wow, that one was loose. And that one was loose. So now you can see it's seeping a little bit here. And having just figured out that those screws were pretty loose, that's probably why it's seeping. There's a heavy spring under here. This is your coasting enricher. You want to put a good amount of pressure and even undo a couple turns at a time, go back and forth. But there's a pretty heavy spring under there, because when you're in gear at higher RPM, say approximately above 2700 RPM, and you close the throttle, the high vacuum comes through this port. There's a diaphragm and a plunger in there, and it pulls that plunger back at high RPM with the throttle shut and shuts off the air to the low speed circuit to help eliminate backfiring. So we'll get that out of the way, and there we go. That spring's not too bad in this one. Some of them have a really stiff spring. You can see that spring gets collapsed a long ways. So you want to make sure that spring's in good shape. This is the vacuum passage. You can see there's a really small hole in there. You want to shoot some carb cleaner in through there and make sure that hole's all clear. That's good. This O-ring has to be in good shape. That O-ring fits in that little hole. That's what seals the vacuum coming in. I'm going to drop him in there. Get this over there. Here's the diaphragm for the coasting enricher. And you want to be careful getting it out. You don't want to pull anything. So when you're running, air actually travels past here on its way to mixes with air, or mixes with fuel. Air goes past here. Air comes through here. And you can't really see it, but there's a hole on both sides of here. One down here. And what it does is under high vacuum, this pushes up and it blocks off the air to the low speed circuit. Until the RPMs come down enough and the vacuum comes down enough, this releases and starts letting air go past, going to the low speed circuit to mix with the fuel the pilot jet supplies for your low speed circuit. That diaphragm, you can hold it up to the light and have a look. You can stretch on it a bit. I usually like to pull it down and just have a real good look. This one's good. You can actually use a flashlight and shine it in there better. So that's the side of the carburetor where the coasting enricher is. Now looking underneath, there's your idle mixture screw. And remember I said down in here, there's 5 holes. 4 grouped together further back, and then 1 up here that lines up directly with the mixture screw. All 5 holes are fed by the pilot jet and the pilot air jet, but only 1 of them is controlled by the mixture screw. The 4 further back are the bypass holes, and that controls just off idle, throttle response, contributes greatly to fuel economy. If you have too big of a pilot jet, you're going to have too much flow out of those 4 holes and get bad mileage. Too small a pilot jet, you're not going to get enough flow out of those holes, and you're going to have probably popping on trailing throttle, lean running, it won't return to idle very well, etc. So let's get that mixture screw out of there. This is my pilot jet snap-on screwdriver, and the reason that's my pilot jet screwdriver is because it's just big enough to fit in the hole. Any bigger it wouldn't fit, any smaller and it wouldn't grab the pilot jet right. You want to make sure your screwdriver is exactly right for the pilot jet hole. It happens to work on the mixture screw too. So I haven't touched this yet, so I'm just going to see how many turns out it is from bottom, and you want to go real easy. So 1/2, 1 1/4. Now if I look in there real good, I can see I just touched it with the drill bit when I was drilling that out. Funny thing is, most of them I see are set at 1 1/4 when spec is actually 1 5/8 from the factory. All of which is really neither here nor there, because in its stock form the carburetor doesn't work right. So that mixture screw really only can work from about 1 1/4 to 1 3/4 unless you put an MCP kit in there. Wow, look at that. The end of it's black. Why is it black? Because it was popping back through the carburetor. So that is a true backfire. A backfire technically in the motorcycle mechanics world, a backfire is backfiring into the carburetor and airbox. So I just wiped off the end of that. The tip of it's nice and clean. This little tip here, if you turn that screw in too hard, this tip breaks off in the carburetor, and the carburetor's 95% of the time the carburetor's done because you can't get that tip out. About 5% of the time you can get the tip out without wrecking the carb. So you want to keep that in mind when you're putting that in. You gently bottom it. You don't screw it in like you're screwing the float bowl screw in or something. So then there's a few more things down in this hole, and what I like to do is I have a twist tie that's got a bit of the end stripped off, so I'll straighten that and then put a little hook on the end. I'm gonna get my side cutters here and make the hook a little smaller because let's see if you can see that. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a wee little hook on the end of that. So I'm going to fish down in this hole, and in this hole, I'll be really careful. There's a spring, and fish again, and I might need to use something a little tougher. Not that. That. Got a fish in here. I'm just going to see if I can dump it out. Nope. Okay, I'm going to put a little more aggressive bend on this. Put a real good hook on there, because there's a washer and an O-ring still down in here. And there they are. So the washer, in this case, is stuck to the O-ring. Often that O-ring sticks inside the hole, so you got to really fish for a while to get it. So I'm going to reassemble this needle just to show you how it goes. So you put the spring on, and then the steel washer, because the washer protects the O-ring from the spring. So if you assemble that all, that's what it looks like. Spring, washer, O-ring. The washer protects the O-ring from the spring. So we'll set that aside. So there's the one hole that the pilot jet feeds. You can see a hole down in there. Well, maybe not, but there is one. And that directly lines up there. You can see that hole there. That's the one the mixture screw controls. See if we can see the other ones. Yes, so there's the 4 holes and the 1 hole the mixture screw controls. Now often I'll take the hook that I used to pull out the O-ring in the washer, and I'll just push it in them holes just to make sure there's nothing real stuck in there, and these are all clear. I'd actually take a little bit of air and blow in there and blow everything backwards, opposite the direction of flow. You don't want to jam stuff in there harder. So that's the mixture screw hole and the bypass holes that the pilot jet and the pilot air jet feed. After that, you start running on the needle, and actually you can see the nozzle the needle runs in hanging out there in the venturi. That nozzle has a specific size hole, and the needle is a specific size that runs through that hole, and that's how you get your mixture in the mid-range. The whole time you're riding, if you're cruising, you're riding on mostly the needle, but when you're cruising, it's half the needle and half the pilot jet. On the highway, when you're cruising, you're on the needle and on the pilot jet. With all other kits, the main jet is affecting it as well, because the carb doesn't work right from factory. So let's go ahead and take the float bowl off, and we'll go through some stuff in there. Now this is real quick to do, and again on the float bowl there's bosses and stuff that fit into indents in the carb body. So it's pretty hard to get the full ball on wrong. Take it off here. Sometimes you have to take these screws out because it's a little tight to the idle speed screw. Is on the right hand side of the carburetor when you're sitting on a bike. So here you see we've got our float, we've got the main jet, the needle jet, all of which holds the nozzle in. Okay, so that nozzle you can see hanging out in the car body there, that's what the needle runs through, and it's all held in by that needle jet with the built-in emulsion tube. So 5/16 or 8mm gets that out. You can see the main jet screwed in there. There's a number stamped on the end. This one, oh, this is a genuine key in, so it's on the side. So, see if it'll focus. So the key in jets have the key in K, and then a 145 is the stock main jet. Now with the MCP kit, more often than not, you're going to change this unless you're at a high altitude. So I'm just going to take that out to show you. Now the reason they call this an emulsion tube is you can see all those wee little holes in the side. 3 on there, and then a whole bunch on the both sides. There's 5 and 5 opposite each other, then 3 and 3. There's a special nozzle out there that has all these wound around and stuff. I'm not convinced that does anything, but anyway, a lot of guys use ultrasonic cleaner or whatever else to clean all this stuff out. That's all fine and dandy, but I find nothing works better than a piece of wire like a twist tie. And I'll show you here, put a few little bends in this puppy so that when you run it through there, you actually mechanically clean these holes using the piece of wire. So you go through and you do all 16 holes with the wire before you stick it in your cleaning solution, and you get a much better clean. So that's the main jet and the emulsion tube / needle jet. Now, like I said, that emulsion tube holds down the nozzle. So you take I just use a little Phillips here just to push that guy out, the nozzle. So I'm going to stack this all together. Now you can see, maybe on the video, this side is convex. The end of the emulsion tube is concave. So they seal and make a seal just from pressure. The other end has an indent, and down in there you can see the lip with the specific size hole. It's very specific, works in conjunction with the size of the needle. This is the end that hangs out in the venturi. So this pushes on that. You screw it in, that holds it in place. Your main jet goes here. And your needle runs through this whole deal, controlling your mid-range mixture. That's the mid-range and wide open throttle fuel control. Now here's where this exactly the right size screwdriver just barely fits in the hole. So we're going to take out the pilot jet. This here's your starter jet. That's fixed. It never changes. It never needs to change. So we'll screw that, and I'll turn it upside down, and there's your pilot jet. Now, my main jets that I supply are EBC, come from the UK. The numbers are stamped on the end of the main jet, on the end of the pilot jet. On Kean, the main jets are stamped on the side, and the pilot jets are stamped on the top. So this is a number 40, which is stock, and the main jet's a 145, which is stock. Again, this is the step that a lot of guys don't do. Get a piece of wire. This one's actually too big. I got smaller twist ties, smaller wires, feed through there and mechanically clear the pilot. All those fancy fluids and stuff like that, yeah, they're great, and the ultrasonic cleaners are nice and blah blah blah. You don't need them. Don't need them unless you got a really badly plugged carburetor body. Another thing to note, the float pin. You can see here, it is held in by the float bowl. Now be really careful you don't lose that sucker if you take the float bowl off by just twisting the carburetor. So I'm going to pull that pin out and show you what's underneath. This is a real pain in the butt if you drop it under the starter of the bike. A lot of times you have to use compressed air to blow it out of there. So you can see there's a little spring hooked to the needle, the float needle, so you can pull it out, and the float needle comes out as one piece. A black Viton tip on the needle. It goes into the seat in that hole there. This is where you get a flooding carburetor. You get something stuck between the end of that needle and the end of the seat. This is a forever needle and seat. That Viton tip stops the wear. Only time you ever have to replace this is if you damage the Viton tip. Keep carburetor cleaner away from all the rubber bits like the diaphragm and the coasting enricher diaphragm, because it'll swell them up and you'll never get them back in. I hear a lot of guys saying stuff about, oh, isn't there a gasket? This is a forever gasket unless something happens. Or maybe in 20-30 years it goes. You never need to change that gasket unless there's a problem. You can see there's a couple raised pieces around where the screw goes through. And again, the carburetor body has indents so that the boss can guide the float bowl into the right position. You want to blow it under that plate to make sure there's no gunk stuck under there, and this one does have gunk in there, but I'm not going to clean it now. That's another day. So that's where the pilot jet goes. That feeds those 5 holes up here. Air comes in here, and you can see the channel here. You can see the channel here going into here. This is where your coasting enricher blocks the air off, because air goes in here, mixes right here. You can see the pilot jet has the bleed holes in the side. This is to let the air and the fuel mix. Fuel comes up this way, air comes in this way, and the whole works goes up mixed. So it's very important to keep those holes all clear, and mechanically clearing them with a piece of wire with some bends in it is the best way to do it, I've found. Now, when you're cleaning the carb, you want to check all these passages. This is where your choke plunger runs, inside this hole, pulling fuel from this starter jet right there. Now, I'm going to start reassembling. Normally I would have contact cleaner out, carb cleaner out, and a little bit of compressed air. You really want to watch compressed air if you don't completely disassemble the... I often don't disassemble this if there's no problem. But the danger is you got to be really careful with compressed air. You blow that diaphragm out. Now, the float. Lots of guys mess up assembling the float, and obviously this would be much cleaner if I was reassembling, but this is just a video on what the components are and how they work. So I get this needle back on the float, get it under the camera here. You can see I've got the little, there's a little wire on top of the needle that you hook on the arm. And that arm is adjustable. It's a metal arm. It's kind of plastic riveted in place. You can bend it to set the float height. Setting the float height is easy. You can do it with a vernier caliper. You can do it with another method that I much prefer. It works on mechanical advantage. And what you do is, there's a trick to it though. Now, I'm going to try and get it to do it. Now if you look, I'm holding the carburetor sideways. If I hold it vertical, you can see that it's compressing the spring-loaded tip on that needle. That's why you hold it to the side. Actually, I'll turn it this way so we can see better. Now I can already see this one is set good. Why do I say that? Because if you look at this line, then you look at this line of the float arm, it is just more than 90 degrees. It's about 95 degrees. You can see the needle compresses, so that's why you hold it sideways. You want it just touching that needle. And you want it just over 90 degrees there. Why? Because that's where its greatest mechanical advantage is. If you bend that tab so that this is below 90 degrees, not only is your fuel level going to be too high in your carb, but it's not going to seal very well, because after it passes 90 degrees, you lose all the mechanical advantage. So this one's good. This would have, if you put a tube on the side of the carburetor, it'd probably have the fuel level about 4 millimeters, 3-4 millimeters below the level of the carb. And I'm going to show you how to do that on another video. So we know the float's okay, other than I'm putting it together dirty just for demonstration. You would chase your pilot jet with a piece of wire, all the holes and the hole through there, because down inside this hole in the end is a really small little hole in there. You got to get a really small piece of wire and feed it through there to mechanically clear it. It is the only way to ensure that it's fully clear. It goes down in this little hole, and again you take your screwdriver. Now keep in mind when you're tightening this, that is a little brass bit with a wee thread going into an aluminum hole, both soft materials. You want to just have it snug. You don't want to crank on it. A couple fingers, not even as tight as you can. It's very, very light touch on that. Then we find our nozzle, and the trick to this is this side of the shoulder is wider. It won't actually protrude into the venturi. This side is smaller, it protrudes into the venturi. This is convex. The end of the emulsion tube / needle jet is concave. They seal, this screws in and holds the whole works in place. So you want to put that in. Before you actually tighten it, you want to have a look and make sure it's sticking out into the venturi, and then we'll give that a little snug. Now the trick is to make this a wee bit tighter. Then you tighten the main jet into it. Then next time you remove the main jet, the whole works doesn't come out. So that's the bottom side of the carburetor. Now we're going to put the mixture screw in. Now, whenever you're putting a mixture screw in, you don't want any of these bits falling off. So you always hold the carburetor upright and screw this up from the bottom and carefully put it in. And enough of it sticks out, you can just about turn it, but not quite. And I'll get my screwdriver hooked up to it and get it, and I'll screw it in this way until I start feeling the spring provide tension. There, now the spring's providing tension. I can turn it over. I know the O-ring and the steel washer are still in place. So now I'll keep going down very gently, and this is where you put the MCP thumb mixture screw in, but we're not doing that today. That's another video. There we go. Just very lightly I found the bottom. Now if I was going to factory spec, I'd go to 1 5/8. If I was going to put the MCP kit in, I'd probably go to 2, 2.5. So we'll go 2.5, so half, 1/2, 2, half. 2.5 is a good starting point. That's the point you turn in and find the drop, where the idle drastically drops. There'll be one place when you're screwing in your mixer screw where the idle drastically drops. Float bowl, after you clean it all out, it's a little bit There, the bosses are lined up. It's seated all the way around. Now we're going to get our float bowl screws back in. And of course, all these passages you would have blown out by now. Don't make the mistake of drilling this brass plug out down here. I've seen guys do that thinking they're getting at the mixture screw. That just covers the hole they use to machine those holes down in the bottom under the butterfly here, bypass holes right in front of the butterfly. If I can get that angle right again, you can see the butterfly just passes those holes. This carburetor is actually a little bit unique. That mixture screw hole is further away from the bypass holes than any other carburetor I've seen. This is actually one of the biggest CV carbs there is out there. There is bigger ones, but this is one of the bigger ones. CV carbs, the distance between those holes kind of affects the way the carburetor has to work, and that plays into the flaws that are present in the carburetor, which I won't go into the carburetor theory part of it, but there's a lean condition and a rich condition down low throttle that offset each other that has gone undiscovered for 30 some years, which the MCP carb kit fixes. So there, that's everything in the bottom. Mixture screws back in, all the jets were back in. We got the float bowl buttoned up. Now you can see on these carbs, this is where you can change these pieces if you ever break them. I have never broken one, but it happens. Gonna put the coasting enricher back together. Get my O-ring out of here. Get the spring. Get the spring lined up with the boss. The spring has another boss on the diaphragm. I'm gonna set the whole works down here. Get this lined up, check my O-ring still there. Then I put the plate on, lined up with the float bowl vent, fuel inlet. Get the screws in here. And again, these do not have to be murder tight. I wouldn't Loctite them. You just got to make sure you keep even pressure on there, because you don't want it going sideways and breaking off an ear or that coasting enricher cover. So just snug. Remember, it's a wee little thread going into aluminum. You got to always take into account the materials and the thread size and the bolt diameter when you're tightening stuff. After years of experience, the only time I really use a torque wrench anymore is on really critical stuff. Got your vent, your vacuum spigots. This one goes to the fuel tap if you haven't converted it to a non-vacuum tap. They're all gravity fed unless you go to like an IMS tank or something. But even them are gravity fed, but they have pumps internally. This one here goes to your air injection system, which can be removed with MCP. MCP would probably pass California emissions set up properly. No other carb kit could do it, not stock, not any of them, because of the flaws that I keep referencing that I'm not going to get into carburetor theory. That's just not what this video is about. So the needle goes in first. Make sure it comes out the hole. Then you put on the needle retainer. And what I like to do is hold my finger on it. Okay, so if you can see, the needle is allowed to float. And this is the part that surprises me. So many people do, like with the KLX kit or something, they'll put a washer under the clip on the KLX needle, and then all of a sudden this needle doesn't float around. And because the slide bounces with the pulses, intake pulses, This needs to float so it doesn't rub hard on the side of the nozzle and wear it out. So if you take up all the float out of this needle, you're just going to wear your carburetor out. So I don't know why it's such a common practice. Now I'm going to just lift this up and see if I can show you that if you don't get this on right, it can actually, there. Now there's a hex inside, and look how much this needle can float if you don't get that thing seated right. So what I often do is I'll put this spring in and I'll turn it. I'll just twist it back and forth, hold it in, and now it doesn't float back and forth, it just has a play so it doesn't wear out the nozzle. This always goes to the front of the carburetor towards the engine. The slide actually can only go in one way, so you're never going to be in trouble there. You just have to make sure the needle lines up with the hole, and this is where a lot of guys get it wrong. And push that needle retainer up so that it'll allow that needle to float like almost half an inch actually. So luckily this carb has been sitting dry for a while, and this diaphragm's not swelled up by the gas vapors. If that's too swelled and you can't get it back in, you take it in the house, wash it in warm soapy water, dry it off, and put it in the fridge. Not the freezer, because you can break it. Put it in the fridge, and what that does is washing it gets all the gas and maybe oil off of there. Putting it in the fridge allows it to shrink back again so you can get it in the groove, because this is where a lot of guys make the mistake, is that somewhere out there and it gives you a real bog and stutter off the bottom. Sometimes the slide won't even raise because it's leaking so much air, but this one's going to be real easy because it's already seated. Remember, you got boss there and there, fit in a groove, there's grooves, so this can go on anyway. Line up the spring boss on the inside of the cap into the spring and put it on like so. Now, this one I don't have to, but I always recommend. You can hear the air moving. By moving the slide up and down like this, you're actually centering the diaphragm properly. And if you look, the cap is seated properly all the way around, so we know we got that slide diaphragm seated, because we can hear the air moving really well. That alone isn't enough to ensure for sure that it's seated, but there's a pretty good chance it's seated if you hear all that air moving. Now, these again, metal screw, although there's a lot of thread into the aluminum, you don't have to put them murder tight. You just put them snug. Once you got too snug, you don't have to hold on so hard. You use your thumb, because that whole sucker is spring loaded, right? Not very much tension, but there is that long spring in there. And we are done. Disassembly, explanation, reassembly. Those are all the components of the CV Carb. And the next video is going to be on cleaning. But that's all the carburetor components and how they work. Idle speed screw, idle mixture screw. And if you really wanted to be diligent, you can open up the butterfly, and then from the back of the carb, you can blow air with compressed air, really low pressure, blow air under there, and the slide will lift. That's how it works. By air traveling past that hole, the slide lifts. You want to make sure your vent is clear. You can just blow air with your lungs or whatever. And when you're cleaning, a cheater way is to just use these two holes by spraying contact cleaner in this hole with the nozzle on the can. You can actually watch it coming out of the 5 holes here. When you squirt in the other hole, not only do you see contact cleaner coming from the nozzle and the needle, but it also comes out the main jet. That's the cheater way to check all the passages are clear. Your choke, I mean, you blow that out. It's not really rocket science. It doesn't have to be exact. You can run a piece of wire through the starter jet, the fixed starter jet I showed you inside the float bowl. Remember, if you don't take this off, you got to be really careful with compressed air, because I often blow compressed air in here after I've blown the circuit with contact cleaner. I blow the contact cleaner out with compressed air. Really low pressure if you don't want to pop this guy. That's a CV carburetor. I hope you learned something. I like doing the videos to help people out. My name's Grant. This is Mega City Performance. Have a good day.